face, and that's why people had coats of arms. So, David, if I were to be granted a coat of arms to tell people who I am, what might it look like?
Well, we have prepared an approval sketch which shows what you might be granted. So you will see here the main charge on the shield is very bold and simple. It's just a great big yellow snake. It's a gold python, which is a reference to Monty Python. For the crest, animals always make the best crests, and we heard that you were rather dominated by your bossy cat at home, so we've given you your cat, and it's holding a quill pen to represent your writing career.
I would like to point out that the cat does not do my writing for me. Ah, and I see there's a motto here.
Messias non est. I think you know what that means.
He's not the Messiah. So if I charged into battle with a cat on my head, you'd know who it was. You'd also know who it was running away as soon as the fighting started. It was a kind of dare to ride into battle with your name plastered all over you. On the other hand, heraldry could also act as a sort of life insurance policy.
One night, Sir Robert Knollys used to ride into battle with an inscription on his helmet which read, "Whoever captures Sir Robert Knollys will gain 100,000 gold coins." Well, you're not going to kill a golden goose like that, are you? Chivalry was so crucial to the conduct of knights that Edward III set up a court of chivalry, and believe it or not, one still exists.
And this is it, the Earl Marshal's Court in the College of Arms. And at the moment, it's an exhibition space for these rather surreal heraldic devices. So, what sort of cases did the Court of Chivalry deal with? Knights on trial for failing to open the drawbridge for a damsel? Or running away from the dragon? The major preoccupation of the courts of chivalry was money.
There were always squabbles to be settled about who owned the rights to which prisoner or how the booty was to be split.
The other major concern of the court of chivalry was settling disputes over the rights to a particular coat of arms or crest. Sometimes the cases went on for years. So, did chivalry reduce the horror of war in any way? Well, yes, it could do, so long as you happen to be a knight.
Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was, according to his biographer, the perfect root of all honour and nobleness, of wisdom, valour and largesse. Here's how he put chivalry into practice.
In 1370, the people of Limoges rebelled against the rule of the Black Prince.
The prince hastened to crush the rebellion, and during the fighting, 3 French knights were cornered by the Duke of Lancaster. Eventually, they had no choice but to surrender. "My lords, we are yours." "You have vanquished us, therefore act according to the law of arms." "By God," replied the Duke of Lancaster, "we do not intend otherwise, and we accept you for our prisoners."
The Duke of Lancaster would make a tidy sum from the ransoms, and the French knights would live to fight another day.
So fine if you were a knight, but the townspeople were not knights, and the Black Prince's chivalry didn't extend quite that far.
All ranks, ages and sexes cast themselves on their knees before the prince, begging for mercy. All were put to the sword. Upwards of 3,000 men, women and children were put to death that day.
The whole point is, the chivalric laws of war had absolutely nothing to do with the Geneva Convention.
Nowhere in the Order of the Garter was there anything about protecting civilians or the proper treatment of ordinary prisoners of war. Chivalry was strictly for the toffs. The irony was, while Edward III was busy glamorizing the code of chivalry, at the same time he had no intention of fighting the French by it.
The army he took across the Channel in 1339 was fundamentally different in its makeup from previous armies. You see, the nature of warfare was changing, thanks largely to economics.
In the 14th century, there was an arms race going on just the same as today, and knights were finding it increasingly expensive to get themselves onto the battlefield. Since Roman times, the standard bit of kit had been the mail coat. But developments in missile technology had brought a new kind of arrow that could go straight through mail. And a new kind of crossbow was developed with even greater penetrating power. So knights started looking for extra protection.
But of course, weapons evolved to be more effective against plate armour.
There's an old French song that describes a knight so terrified that he soiled his saddle blanket. I'm not surprised.
As the expense soared, many of the landed gentry tried to avoid military service. So, when Edward landed in France at the beginning of what was to be the 100 Years' War, the bulk of his army were paid soldiery, mostly from the lower ranks of society.
This army also contained another element that was enough to make any noble knight soil his saddle blanket. For all his chivalrous talk, Edward was preparing a distinctly down-to-earth surprise for the French. He had thousands and thousands of well-trained peasant archers, all armed with longbows. Never mind the chivalry, kill the horses. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, thousands of French noblemen charged in full pageantry. But the English were playing by a different rule book.
In 5 minutes of battle, the English loosed more than 300,000 arrows. The flower of French chivalry was cut down by archers on threepence a day. In all, the French lost over 5,000 men to a few hundred English. In 1360, both sides had had enough. A peace treaty was signed, and that was when the world changed. Edward said, "Right, come on, my lot home. Stop fighting. Come on, home, everybody."
Nobody took any notice. They were having far too good a time. You see, a lot of Edward's army didn't have any homes to go to. They may have been fighting in France for 20 years. They may have captured a castle, and there they were, living like lords. Why should they go home?
And so a new kind of military captain emerged. Many styled themselves knights, whether they'd been actually knighted or not. And they formed themselves into what they called free companies, fighting neither for Lord nor God, but for themselves. They were bands of robbers on a nightmare scale. One company was reported to be 16,000 strong.
The free companies swept down through France, causing havoc and destruction. And eventually they descended on Avignon here, which in those days happened to be the residence of the Pope. They burnt the surrounding countryside and threatened to attack God's representative on earth unless he handed over a spiritually uplifting sum of money.
Eventually, the Pope coughed up around 100,000 florins, enough to pay a 14th century construction worker for about, 3,000 years.
God's representative on earth was a realist, and he knew they couldn't be bought off easily. So he said to the brigands, "Look, boys, I'll throw in free pardons for all the sins you may have committed up to now, and I'll tell you what, I'll even have a word with a man I know who can find you some work in Italy." Now, I can't say fairer than that, can I?
Now, it wasn't a stupid suggestion. Italy was full of career opportunities for mercenary soldiers with nowhere to go.
Of course, Italy didn't actually exist in those days. It consisted of a lot of city-states like Pisa, Rome, Florence, Milan, Mantua, and so on. And they'd been at each other's throats for centuries. But the citizens weren't exactly interested in fighting, so they'd got into the habit of employing mercenary companies to do their fighting for them.
Which brings us back to this chap, Sir John Hawkwood, perhaps the most famous English knight of his day. He was not a nobleman, but a son of a tanner who'd made his way up through the ranks. Hawkwood soon established his own mercenary company and made such a good living fighting for whoever would pay him that he was able to buy several castles, like this one in Tuscany. Not bad for a poor lad from Essex.
Sir John was not a chivalric knight. He had no pretence to lofty ideals, and he didn't fight for glory or honour. He was simply a businessman whose business happened to be war. In 1377, Hawkwood was under contract to a certain cardinal by the name of Roberto. Now, Roberto had a quarrel with the citizens of this town, Cesena. They'd murdered some of his soldiers. However, Roberto magnanimously offered them an amnesty if they'd surrender their arms. Foolishly, the citizens of Cesena thought they could trust the word of a cardinal priest of the Order of the Holy Apostles. As soon as they were disarmed, Cardinal Roberto summoned Hawkwood from nearby Faenza, where he'd been busy coordinating the rape of all the female inhabitants. The cardinal said he wanted justice. By justice, he meant blood and more blood. The resulting massacre shocked Europe.
According to one chronicler, they burned and slaughtered all the town. The river was coloured with blood, and among the smoking ruins, the rapes, the killings, was a pitiful episode. 24 friars were killed in front of the main altar, along with the congregation. One account claimed that 8,000 had died and 16,000 fled. Every building was destroyed. However, this wasn't the sort of thing that harmed a military man's reputation. Far from it. And for the last 15 years of his life, Hawkwood was under more or less permanent contract to the city of Florence.
When Hawkwood died, the city laid on a funeral of epic proportions and celebrated him as a hero. The Florentines never lost their sense of business. You see, they'd promised Hawkwood a magnificent marble tomb right here in the great cathedral of Florence. However, when Richard II requested Hawkwood's body be returned to England, the Florentines decided to cut their losses. And instead, they put up this magnificent painting of what the magnificent marble tomb would have looked like if they'd built it.
Nonetheless, the tanner's son from Essex had become virtually a nobleman by turning warfare into a business. The mercenary and the knight had become one and the same. But was there ever really a difference? The knight of fantasy never really did exist. All that rescuing damsels and helping the weak was just wishful thinking. Even in the Middle Ages, chivalry could mean what you wanted it to mean.
Maybe we're better off without chivalry. Its fine ideals were all too often used to perpetuate warfare, which is what those who live by war want. One of Hawkwood's contemporaries said of him, he managed his affairs so well there was little peace in Italy in his time. And I guess it's still true that those who promote war are usually those who are going to profit from it, whether they're arms manufacturers, politicians, or knights in shining armour.